We've been looking at one paragraph in each book of the Bible, and we have finally come to the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation. And I want us to look at the paragraph in chapter 21, verses 1 through 8. If you haven't already, take a few moments to look over that, and then let's review some of these thoughts together. In Revelation chapter 21, we read, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." So, we know from the second part of the verse here that what we know right now of earth, of physical universe, has passed away. Whether that's a complete destruction and God recreates everything, or whether that's a wiping the slate clean but using the slate, what we have here is a new creation. That's the backdrop. And on this backdrop now, God begins to paint this picture for us. But the backdrop is a new heaven and a new earth. So then he goes on to say, with that backdrop, that new creation, new heaven, new earth, verse 2, I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Now, we have to ask ourselves, what is the holy city, this New Jerusalem? There's a lot of interpretation that we would have to get into, but let me suggest that this may be the church herself. The redeemed, those who belong to Jesus Christ, those who will inhabit the new heaven and new earth, those, the church, who would be prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. The end of verse 2 is what makes the beginning of verse 2 more challenging for us than just reading the words city and Jerusalem and thinking, oh, new heavens, new earth, and there's a new city of Jerusalem, and there we are. Let's see what it looks like. You could look down into later on in your chapter, verse 9 of 21. Then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of seven last plagues and spoke to me, saying, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." Well, we know who the bride of Christ is. That's the church. And he carried me away in the spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And then there's this description of the city that we've heard so much of, the gemstones and the length and width and height and so on and so forth. So the great interpretive question becomes, is the holy city, the New Jerusalem, the church of Jesus Christ? Or perhaps we could better ask, is the church the bride of Christ, or is the bride of Christ a city of brick and mortar and gemstones as described there? I think when we sort it all out, we want to be real careful that we don't ignore how the Bible defines the bride of Christ. So let's just assume that my explanation or my interpretation is accurate, and this is the church. The church being highlighted as the inhabitants of the new heaven and new earth as the bride of Christ. That would make sense then to hear a loud voice from the throne, verse 3, saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God." And all the pronouns continue. Their eyes. No more crying, no more pain. this seems very personal, to have the backdrop of a new heaven and a new earth, and then to see the new Jerusalem where God dwells as actually with his people, with the church. It makes sense for the next verses to say, and here's why the church is right here in the new heavens and new earth, because the promise of God had been to dwell with man. He will dwell with them and they would be his people and he would be their God. This goes back to Exodus 19, just before the Ten Commandments are given. And it's repeated, what we'll see in our study of 1 Peter chapter 2, that same covenant language. God is faithful to the blessings that he promised in his covenant to Abraham and ultimately all of Abraham's family, even those who are Abraham's family by faith. God will dwell with them. And as they are welcomed into that eternal dwelling place with God, we read, he will wipe away every tear. Death will be no more. No more mourning, no more crying, no more pain. For all these former things that existed in the old heaven and old earth, they have passed away. All those things are gone. We are restored to Eden-like circumstances. It's that new creation. It's the beauty of our dwelling with God in his presence, just as Adam and Eve did in the garden. Verse 5, and he who was seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. Here's this promise that we look forward to with hope, that all this is true. God will dwell with us, and we will be his people, that we won't be afflicted by all the sorrows and the consequences of sin and the curse. We hold out hope that in the fullness of our redemption, in the fullness of our inheritance, we will receive this promise. God is making all things new. And having given that promise, he said, write this down, for these things are trustworthy and true. And he said, it is done. He goes on to say, I am the Alpha and the Omega, which is the beginning and the end, the first and the last letters of the Greek alphabet. So God is from everlasting to everlasting, and in between, so everlasting past, everlasting future, in between is Alpha to Omega. So there's the beginning and there's the end of human time. But God outlasts that. He is Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. And in that bit of human history, God says, to the thirsty, I will give a spring of water without payment. Verse 7, a call to endure. Endure. The one who conquers will have this heritage. I will be his God and he will be my son. And so we persevere to the end. We've studied that doctrine recently in church. And then a warning. As for the cowardly and the faithless, the detestable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. So in the first death, their bodies would die. The second death is this spiritual death, the finality of eternal separation from God. The warning then is not just in the consequence. The warning follows the invitation. To the thirsty, I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. Go back to John 4 and read the story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And Jesus uses this analogy of thirst and water to explain the sinner's need for God's salvation. This is grace, God's grace to sinners, to give them life. Let me get a different color here. Life without payment. That's grace. Don't reject his grace, or else you face the second death. Revelation is full of a lot of questions, a lot of interesting language, but I think what we can gather from Revelation 21 is this great hope that we, the Church of Jesus Christ, the believing ones, his children, his bride, will live in a new heaven and a new earth with none of the effects of sin and always in the presence of God, which is exceeding joy. So even so, come, Lord Jesus, and come quickly. Grace and peace for your endurance.